It is time to continue in our study of the book of 1 Kings. The last time we were together, we almost finished chapter 2. We actually had read all the verses and pretty well discussed all the verses and kind of left off right before verse 52 and verse 53. So we'll very briefly mention those and then we'll go ahead and get ready to move into chapter 2. But essentially where we had left off was Adonijah and all of his following had received the word that Solomon was actually anointed as king, and Adonijah's followers left him like he was the plague. They all scattered, they ran, and Adonijah immediately turned and he ran to the altar and he grabbed hold of the horns of the altar, right? Essentially, he was begging mercy from Solomon, saying, please don't kill me, spare my life, right? Well, ultimately, Solomon, what we see in those last couple of verses of 1 Kings chapter 1, Solomon's response to this plea of Adonijah in verse 52, Solomon says, if he proves himself a worthy man, not a hair of him shall fall to the earth, but if wickedness is found in him, he shall die. Solomon flat out tells him, look, the ball's in your court. You have the opportunity to prove yourself a worthy man. Yes, you've rebelled against David, you've somewhat rebelled against me, but you have this opportunity. You can prove yourself to be a good man. And if you do, he says not a single hair will fall to the earth, but if you do not, if wickedness is found in you, you will die. That's going to be the consequence if you turn from me or turn from us again. Verse 53, so King Solomon sent them to bring him down from the altar. And he came and he fell down before King Solomon, and Solomon said to him, go to your house. So they remove him from the altar. He has his death grip essentially on the horns of the altar. They remove him from that. He's told he won't die as long as he proves himself to be a worthy man. And Solomon says, now go to your house. Some suggest that this statement may be the idea of you're no longer going to have any influence as it pertains to the political standing. You're going to go to your house, you're going to be quiet, you're going to be peaceable, and you're not going to turn against us, or you will ultimately lose your life. Maybe that's what he's implying, not sure. He just tells him, go home. Mind your business. You're spared for now. Mind your business. It's up to you. The ball's in your court. Things will play out however you live, right? That is all of 1 Kings chapter 1. Now we will go ahead and get into 1 Kings chapter 2, and the major focus here at the beginning of chapter 2 in the first 12 verses are the last words of King David. Now we'll go ahead and break this down a little bit smaller, just the same verse by verse. The first section is going to be faithful to the Lord. This is David's instruction that he's going to give to Solomon, is to make sure that he's maintaining his faithfulness to God. Now we'll go ahead and read. I'll go ahead and read verses 1 through 4, and then we'll come back through and we'll begin to make discussion and some application. But here's what David has to say, or here's the words of David presented here in chapter 2. It says, now the day of David drew near that he should die, and he charged Solomon his son, saying, I go the way of all the earth. Be strong, therefore, and prove yourself a man. And keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his judgments, his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn, that the Lord may fulfill his word which he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons take heed to their way, to walk before me in truth with all their heart and with all their soul, he said, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. It's pretty interesting when you consider this time in David's life. We've already recognized David is an aged man. He's weak in his physical stature. He's reaching the latter part of his life, but we did say that it seems to be that he's still very sharp as it pertains to his mind. And now he has this opportunity to impart this last bit of instruction, this last bit of knowledge, if you will, to Solomon, his son, who's now coming in to take the throne after the death of Solomon. And it's an incredible opportunity of influence. It's his last words, his final charge to his son. And it should have somewhat of an emotional tie to it that would make it very difficult for Solomon to not uphold what David is telling him to do. You know, I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but I didn't until, I guess, reading through this text. Have you ever considered, given the opportunity, what your last words to a loved one might be? You ever considered, even if you had the chance, if you had the knowing that, okay, my life is about to end, and you had the opportunity to share a few last words or thoughts or give some final instruction to a wife, to a husband, to a brother, sister, son, daughter, a family member, what might it be? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just think Christians today, hopefully, if we were blessed with that opportunity to tell your sons and your daughters and your spouse, your farewell words, be faithful.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder how often instead it's, okay, there's this bank account, don't forget that one. Don't forget, giving more attention to worldly matters
Mm-hmm.
than the one thing that really matters.
Right.
And I'd really be afraid to know, what's really on our mind first too often.
Mm-hmm.
Because, really the only thing that we really need to be concerned about at that point would be to charge and say, dear son, daughter,
Mm-hmm.
be faithful.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you couldn't hear Chris, just trying to consider, how often would it be the case that someone would take that opportunity to turn and point a loved one, a son, a daughter, a spouse directly to God and the necessity of that relationship with God. I think Jim had something first, and I'll come back to you, David.
Jerry had an aunt that was a member of the church. She had two sons. One was a faithful member and also served as an elder in the church. Her other son was a Baptist preacher. At her funeral, she had written both of them what they were going to say at her funeral. She preached a lesson to her Baptist son. It was obvious as everything in what she had written to him that he had to say at her funeral. She got the last word
Right.
to her son.
That'll give you chills thinking about that.
And everybody there knew who that lesson was directed at.
Right. Even in those last written words, still providing instruction to turn to God. That's impressive. Yes, sir.
Well, Solomon was blessed that David was still so coherent
Mm-hmm.
that he could listen to him and soak up what he told him. He needed to be like a sponge.
Mm-hmm.
He needed to gather every bit of it up. But he was lucky that he was, as feeble as he was still coherent in his mind and he could pass it on.
Right. And I think, for the most part, Solomon seems to readily, receive this and apply, for the first part of his reign at least, the vast majority of this. We see him begin to make some mistakes along the way, but I think, and it's that maybe the emotional tie to it. He is probably well aware that, of course, David has reached his latter days, and he takes very much to heart the things that David has to say to him. And just the same, given that opportunity, I think it's an outstanding opportunity to impart some influence or instruction on those that we care about dearly. And who knows what kind of effect it might have, on them. But I'm kind of with Chris. I'm afraid to even know honestly how much worldly advice and, of course, words of affection or things of that nature are more of what are shared in those last moments than be strong, be courageous, that type of thing, kind of like you see even in the charge of Joshua. I've never heard of someone being able to write out and actually have the sermon preached to the person preaching it, but that's pretty good to continue to spread that word and continue to try and influence someone even in a situation such as that. If you do want a good study though, just one for your own personal study, a good study is to go through and look at some of these final charges that are given from one leader to the next leader in line. You could look at Moses and Joshua. Deuteronomy chapter 31, verses 1 through 8. You could look at Joshua to Israel in Joshua chapter 23, or even Samuel to Saul in 1 Samuel chapter 12. You could go all the way through, even, to this account, and you could continue through the Bible all the way up to Jesus, to the Apostle Paul, to all these who have imparted a little bit of wisdom to those that they were leaving behind, and it would be a very good study for yourself personally. It maybe, prepare us, given the opportunity that we could do something similar to somebody else or for somebody else. Now, in verse 2, he says, I go the way of all the earth. David was well aware of his mortality and his impending death. It was very soon to find him. But death is still a very humbling topic. You take a king who sits on a throne and he is no more immune to a beggar on the street. He has an appointment with death. It's coming no matter what. And how much can this be something that just stings the pride of an individual who is one who is of great stature, one who has great wealth and prosperity here on this earth? But even in David at this, you still hear these very humble, these very pleasing words and instruction to make sure that he turns wholeheartedly to God. And it very much echoes the charge even given at the beginning of Joshua, be strong and be courageous. He tells him, prove yourself to be a man, after the fact of saying, be strong, prove yourself to be a man. Now, the be strong could be somewhat tied to the fact that, Solomon is fixing to be the man in charge. He's fixing to be king, and he's no longer going to have David to give him these words of instruction. He's no longer going to have him to lean on for any kind of support. He's fixing to be gone. But I think it's more the idea to be strong in the sense of steadfast mentally, steadfast physically, and steadfast spiritually. I think that's more the charge in this idea of be strong. But he says, prove yourself to be a man. In a day where people are so confused as to whether or not they are a man or a woman, how much does this charge need to ring out today? Prove yourself to be a man. I don't even know if I would want to know what the world would actually claim proving yourself to be a man is. And I think it might change from one age group to the next age group. Say in your 20s, you might think proving yourself to be a man consists of this or that. Where you reach 30 years old, and maybe you have a wife and you have some children, you now think something else of that. To the point that you're a grandparent, you might even have a whole nother perspective on what it means to prove yourself to be a man. What do we see as it pertains to prove ourselves to be a man? What would you say it takes to prove yourself a man? Of course, speaking to the men here.
Being faithful.
Faithfulness.
The steadfastness of keeping God's commandments.
Right.
In the face of whatever trials, tribulations.
Definitely something that's going to be something Solomon's going to have to face, right? He's going to have a lot being the leader, being the king, where he's going to have to prove himself a man, prove himself a worthy king and leader for God's people. Yes, sir.
Guard your life so that you can stay steadfast, resist bad influences.
More than just an offensive tactic, but also a defensive, guarding yourself and making sure you're maintaining your steadfastness to God. Absolutely. 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 13. Now this is from the King James Version because I really like how it lays it out here. 1 Corinthians 16:13, watch ye, stand fast in the faith, quit you like men, and be strong. There is a call for a godly man to be strong and courageous, but at the same time, I think it implies just the same within this prove yourself a man, that there is spirituality that has to be alongside that strength and that wisdom. He's still going to be the king. Yes, he's going to lead the people, but he also has to follow the will of God, and he has to be a spiritually minded man if he's truly going to be the man of God that God would have him to be, right? Same could be said today. If we're truly going to prove ourselves to be men, again, talking to the men, we're going to live the life that God would have us to live, and it's going to be far different from what the world expects or thinks that a man actually is. It's going to come with faithfulness. It's going to come with humility. It's going to come with servitude. It's going to come with providing for your family. Responsibility. All kinds of things that is not necessarily on the radar of the world's idea of what a man truly is. So there's a lot of importance to it. Yes, sir.
I was going to say, Paul tells the Corinthians there in the last verse of chapter 15 in 1 Corinthians. He says, therefore, my beloved brethren, be ye steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your work is not in vain in the Lord.
Major emphasis on staying abounding in the work, right? Make sure you're doing these things so that you can continue steadfast. Well, the text,
Working for God, you can't be working for Satan.
right? One side of the fence or the other, right? The text actually lays it out for us. It gives us the answer. He tells him, look, you need to be strong. You need to therefore prove yourself a man. And he lays out the answer in the text. Here's what it looks like. This is what I need you to do. Somebody go ahead and read verse 3 for us again.
And keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his judgments, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do, and wherever you turn, that the Lord may fulfill his word, which he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons take heed to their way, to walk before me in truth, with all their heart and with all their soul, he said, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel.
Thanks, sir. So here's the answer. Here's what it means to be a man as it pertains to in the eyes of God. And this is the instruction that David is giving to Solomon, his son, to keep the charge of God. That's the first part. Keep the charge of God. To be obedient to his word in all facets of life. And then he goes on to say to walk in his ways. Ultimately to live in harmony with God's will throughout your life. He says to keep his statutes and his commandments. Be obedient to his laws, his requirements, his expectations of you, and to keep his judgments and testimonies, to honor and to follow God's revealed wisdom. This is what David is trying to tell to Solomon. You're going to prove yourself a man, and this is how you're going to do it. Here's what's expected of you. Now, the reminder is that these things are written in the law of Moses. These are things that you should have already read, you should already know, and you should already be applying to your life. Jump back to Deuteronomy chapter 10. Deuteronomy chapter 10. Here's a 4-point sermon for anybody who goes out and preaches on Sundays at these different congregations. 4-point sermon in Deuteronomy chapter 10. Verses 12 through 13. Deuteronomy 10, verse 12, it says, and now Israel, what does the Lord God require of you? What's the expectation? Number 1, to fear the Lord your God. Number 2, to walk in all his ways and to love him. Number 3, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all of your soul. And 4th, to keep the commandments of the Lord and his statutes, which I command you today for your good. Almost identical to the things that David is now saying to Solomon. This is written in the law. These are things that they should have known or should know and should already be applying to their lives. Now, jump over to Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 18 through 19. Now, this is as it pertains to the king and his responsibility. And even going back to the thought of the end of verse 4 where it talks about if they follow in my way, if they continue to follow me, there will always be a king to reign over Israel. Well, look at Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 18 and 19. It says, also it shall be when he sits on the throne of his kingdom that he shall write for himself a copy of this law in a book from the one before the priests, the Levites, and it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, and be careful to observe all the words of the law and these statutes. Now, this is some of the law that was already set in place pertaining to kings well before there was ever kings. And the idea is this king needs to write these laws down. He needs to have his own copy. He needs to read these things so that he does not turn away from me. These things he should know, David would know. Yes, sir.
Something else to think that I was thinking about as we read through this is also looking at it from a perspective of saying a man as an adult, a mature person.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to be the king now. You have to have maturity.
Mm-hmm.
And thinking about it's not what I want to do, it's following God's precepts. I think about 1 Corinthians chapter 13, 11. When I was a child, I spoke as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things. It's putting away that selfish desire, those things that I might want to do, and throwing a fit, like we see Solomon did whenever he got, or not Solomon, Saul did whenever he got mad. Putting those things away, you have to be a man now. You're the ruler of God's people.
And it comes with that mature spirituality, but ultimately what do we see being Solomon's downfall? His desires, his lust, and it turns him away from the Lord.
We don't see this, if we think about it from that strong, manly part of things like Joshua and David as that. He wasn't the same warrior that his father was.
Right.
Battlefield, he wasn't that. He was a different kind of king. Because
Yeah.
that's why he got to build the temple, was because he wasn't going to be shedding the blood like his father did.
Wasn't the same man of war that David was.
Right.
Right. Big part of that, as far as, we look at the manliness or that of, Joshua and Moses or other leaders, and forget about the submission and things of that nature, making sure that we are submitting fully to the Word of God. And that's kind of where that idea, I think the world would have a completely different view of what a man, what it means to be a man. Much of those things, I think, would be completely overlooked, not even likely spoke of. But there's a great deal of spiritual maturity that needs to be there, for Solomon to be who it is that he's going to have to be to lead the people. You think about even the writings of Solomon and the very end of Ecclesiastes. How fitting was it for Solomon to write the last couple of verses in the book of Ecclesiastes? This is the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. It sounds like at that point, now I don't know exactly when he wrote that in comparison to all the mistakes that he makes later on as we go through the book of Kings, but it seemed like at one time he had it figured out. Fear God, keep his commandments. Yes, ma'am. Bless you.
Joshua was told, be strong and courageous. Courageous means a lot of things. Not give in when you need to stand for the right.
Yeah, courageous can come in so many different forms, especially today, where we might allow pride to step in place and not allow our courage to stand forward. There's so many different instances where courage would be seen differently from what it was in Joshua's day, but it's still something, that we have to be able to show in our lives just the same today. So absolutely. As it pertains with this instruction that David has given Solomon, just a point of application as it pertains to leadership. When you consider a position of authority or leadership of any kind, the position of authority that is given to that person does not give them the right to be the standard or the source of the law, if you will. A position of authority that they are given puts them in a position to submit themselves to the law, Word of God, so that they can lead the rest of the people how God would have them to live, right? That's his position. That's what the expectation is of David. He submits to the will of God first. He keeps the will of God first. Then he can show the people how also to do the same thing. And you can make that apply just the same with the eldership and the congregation. They're not the standard, though they apply the Word of God to their lives and show the congregation how to live according to the will of God, right? They're shepherding the flock. But you could also take that to the mayor of the town. You could take that to the governor of Texas. You could take that all the way to Joe Biden. What's the best thing for you to do? What's found in verse 3 of 1 Kings chapter 2. to keep the charge of God, to walk in His ways, to keep His statutes, His commandments, to keep His judgments and His testimonies. Do that in your life and then show other people how to do it in their life. And that's the expectation, ultimately, is what David is trying to show Solomon. Here's what you need to do, and here's how you're going to prove yourself a man in doing so. But he goes on to say that you may prosper in all that you do, wherever you turn. That's the latter part of verse 3 after this instruction that he has provided. Now, we don't want to go all prosperity gospel type teaching or anything of that nature, but what do you make of this? You will prosper in everywhere that you go. Anything that you do, if you keep these commandments, if you do this, in what ways, how will they prosper in everything that they do?
That means succeed.
Mm-hmm.
Prosper doesn't always mean money.
Right.
Same thing as in Psalm 1.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think he'll prosper.
He'll prosper in everything that he does, everything that he lays his hands to, essentially.
Produce fruit.
Right.
Not wither,
Seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you.
Hmm.
It doesn't say big house, lots of money,
Right.
everything that you want. It says that you'll have added unto you the things that you need.
Right. Not the material things that sometimes people may hope for, but rather maybe more so on the spiritual things, the blessings that are found, the spiritual blessings that God will continue to bless His people with when we keep His word and we follow in His statutes. And ultimately, I think this ties even to the next verse as far as it pertains to their prospering and their prosperity. Yes, sir.
I think there in the direct context, I think the application, there was a physical application
Mm-hmm.
and a spiritual. But the spiritual application is very much to us today. And if we do those things, then we are rich.
Mm-hmm.
We are rich spiritually.
Right.
And when you're that, it will not make any difference whether, like Paul's attitude, he had been rich, he'd been poor materially.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't make any difference to him.
Right.
He was rich spiritually. That was the only thing that mattered.
Right.
That's a guarantee, though. If we do those things, we will prosper.
Mm-hmm.
We will spiritually prosper. We'll be blessed beyond measure. Whatever our lot is in the material world, that's just really a side.
Right. I don't think it's, it's definitely, you have to look at the spiritual, but even, you may gain, in the same sense, you may gain, you may be prosperous in this world, but I think a lot of that ties to your character and who you are. Christ being seen in your life, gaining favor with people and things of that nature. But I think, like you were saying originally, part of this is physical prosperity that'll be seen through the kingdom. And I think that ties to verse 4, where he gets to the point of saying, if you do these things, if your sons take heed to my ways and all of this, there will never lack a king to sit on the throne of Israel. Well, if that's what had been told, and that goes all the way back to 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 12 and 13, that Davidic promise, if that's the case, then why does Israel and Judah wind up split? They didn't do it, right? So the ball was in their court. They had the opportunity. So if Solomon would have remained faithful and not done the things that we will see him do in taking many wives and all these other things, would God have upheld his promise? Absolutely. He would have had another son who would have came in, who would have reigned and would have been a king on the throne. And if that would have continued, if they would have been faithful, it would have continued. But God knew it wasn't going to happen. He knew beforehand everything that was going to take place. But regardless, the instruction was, here's what will happen if they continue to follow in my ways. There will never be a lacking of a king to sit on the throne of Israel. The result was because of their own action, their own choices and everything that they did. But, if we truly want to be successful, going back to what Chris was saying, if we truly want to be successful in this life, our greatest success is our relationship with God, a right relationship with our God. Prosperity is not limited to physical things. It also extends to the spiritual. And in many cases where prosperity, great wealth, and many material belongings are one person's and they abound greatly, a lot of the time true happiness and joy is not found in that person's life. I don't know if I've used this quote before here, but it was actually by Jim Carrey, the actor, right, comedian. He said it's his wish that everybody, it's his wish that everybody gets rich and famous and buys and does everything that they want to so that they can see that is not the answer. It sounds a lot like some of Solomon's writings, right? Grasping for the wind, searching for all these things. He had all the money, all the wisdom, everything that he needed. And ultimately, in the end, he says, you know what? It's grasping for the wind. Vanity of vanities. We can search all day long for the prosperity of this world, but if we lose sight of our relationship with God, it's all worthless. It's all empty. Yes, sir.
I was going to say, if we do what God wants us to do, and we become faithful servants to Him, then we will achieve what He wants us to achieve. And in that, we will have our hope of eternal life with Him.
There are no greater riches than the hope that we have in salvation, through Jesus Christ. There's no greater wealth or anything that this world can offer for us than that hope that we have through Christ Jesus. But that kind of sums up those first 4 verses. We'll go ahead and we'll move into the next several, verses 5 through 9. This takes kind of a strange twist here. I have this as repay what is due. You've had this instruction, this really good advice from David. Turn your life to God, follow Him, do everything that He wants you to do, and you're going to do great. The kingdom will do great. It will succeed. It will be prosperous. And then you have this section that is somewhat like a execution order. So it's kind of strange. We're going to go ahead and read verses 5 through 9, and then we'll go back and try and discuss it so we can better understand it, because at first glimpse, it kind of makes you ask, well, what is going on here? Why is he giving this instruction? All right, verse 5, it says, "Moreover, you know also what Joab, the son of Zeruiah, did to me, and what he did to the 2 commanders of the armies of Israel, to Abner, the son of Ner, and Amasa, the son of Jether, whom he killed. And he shed the blood of war in peacetime, and put the blood of war on his belt that was around his waist, and on his sandals that were on his feet. Therefore, do according to your wisdom, and do not let his gray hair go down to the grave in peace, but show kindness to the son of Barzillai, the Gileadite, and let them be among those who eat at your table. For so they came to me when I fled from Absalom your brother. And see you have with you Shimei, the son of Gera, a Benjamite from Bahurim, who cursed me with a malicious curse in the day when I went to Mahanaim. But he came down to meet me at the Jordan, and I swore to him by the Lord, saying, I will not put you to death with the sword. Now therefore, do not hold him guiltless. For you are a wise man and know what you ought to do to him, but bring his gray hair down to the grave with blood." This is a little, kind of a strange twist, right, to what we've just seen in the instruction that was given to Solomon from David. Almost like, okay, now here's marching orders, and here's a few people I need you to make sure that their life ends, and it ends soon. David, if you think about it, he couldn't build the temple because he was a man of war. He had shed much blood. Solomon is the one who is now to build the temple, and the first thing that David is telling him is follow God, but yes, go make sure that these guys are no more. So it's kind of strange, but as we move through the text, I think we can kind of gain some understanding on the first one as it pertains to Joab. I think it's pretty easy to find a reason why he does what he does to Joab. The more difficult one is actually down there in verse 8 and verse 9 as it pertains to Shimei. Because David himself said, I will not put you to death by the sword. That's what it says at the end of verse 8. Yet now he's telling Solomon, make sure that he dies. Use your wisdom. Make sure that this takes place. So we're going to go through and we're going to look at each one of these individuals. The middle section there adds a little bit of maybe a little bit more peaceful language, as he says, now I want you to maintain a good relationship with so-and-so, this one that helped him, Barzillai, but as it pertains to Joab and it pertains to Shimei, they have some stuff coming to them. So let's go ahead and discuss just a little bit in the last bit of time that we have. Those that are mentioned in verse 5 that Joab had killed, you have the mention of Abner. Remember, Joab killed him because Abner had killed Asahel. That was Joab's brother. That was in 2 Samuel chapter 3. So somewhat of a revenge thing there. But even in that, David mourns over this death, and he turns and he's mourning so much that he says that I'm not going to eat until the sun goes down. If I do, may the same things happen to me. And all the people see David mourning, and the people say, okay, well, we're going to mourn too, and we're not going to eat until the sun goes down, essentially. Well, at the end of that section, in 2 Samuel chapter 3 and verse 29, David says this, the Lord shall repay the evildoers. So it sounds like he's going to allow God's will, to take care of these evildoers. Well, Joab is essentially in that category of evildoer here. Then you move on to Amasa. This is who David had appointed as commander over the army in 2 Samuel chapter 19. Remember, after Absalom had rebelled, this was, if I'm not mistaken, this was Absalom's commander, right? And then David moved Amasa in as his commander in this effort to gain the favor of the people back. And then when he gained the people's favor back, then he's going to work his way back into Jerusalem, and Amasa is going to be his commander. Well, Joab didn't like that, and by the time that you get to 2 Samuel chapter 20, he ruthlessly kills Amasa. Right? Remember, he pretty well gutted him, and his entrails fell out on the ground. He's laying in the street, left his body there, completely a ruthless murder. Somebody else had to come along and actually move his body out of the street. Well, this is the two people that are mentioned. And Joab, in that second, is somewhat just trying to secure his spot as commander, and he's going to do so in whatever means is necessary. The question I ask myself when I look at this, why didn't David take care of this when he was king, before? I mean, would it not have been just?
I imagine they did a bunch of dirty stuff with each other through all that time that he felt a bond with Abner that he wasn't. Abner probably saved his life so many times that he couldn't take Abner's life, even though Abner had to do with his own son's death. But he probably wasn't going to his physical hands.
Well, isn't it? I mean, he doesn't even hit on everything that Joab did.
Joab.
Right?
Abner, Joab
he only specifies these two things.
Yeah.
I don't know. When I look at all the history there, it's like David had the right, it seemed. There was just cause for him to do it himself, but for whatever reason, and I don't know if we can pinpoint it with certainty, for whatever reason, he didn't do it. Whether that was political moves or whatever it was, he just didn't do it. Yes?
He sent word back to kill Bathsheba, and Joab got that. So Joab had figures on David too. So
Well, that's true. That's very true. Joab and David? Were they? That was Preston's section, so I'm gonna defer that. What's that?
I remember Joab was a nephew.
Joab was a nephew, is what Preston is thinking.
The reason why he wanted Solomon to take care of that, because Joab was a problem, and he would cause Solomon a problem.
Right. Well, in the things that are not mentioned, he lists these two killings, this murder that was committed, or this, him killing them, and he doesn't mention several other things. Now, we also know at the beginning of 1 Kings, the rebellion, he sides up immediately with Adonijah. He doesn't even mention that. But it's like he already had it fixed in his mind before all this. Well, something's going to come up, and ultimately he's going to wind up being killed, and he's passing this off now to Solomon. But I didn't think about the familial tie because David did have a problem with, bringing judgment on family. We see that again and again throughout 2 Samuel. Yes, sir.
I was gonna say, David knew all the problems that Joab had caused for him, and then here he has already tried to support Adonijah instead of Solomon. And so if he remains, he's gonna be a problem.
Right. Right. Johnny is saying essentially if he's, remains in there with the problems he's already caused, he will likely cause more problems, and that could have been the case. Well, I had really figured we'd get all the way through verse 12, but we had good conversation about what we did cover, so we'll pick up the next time there at the latter part of verse 5 and continue forward from there. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your comments.